Good morning, friends. Welcome to our first morning of Faith for Living with Dr. Lisa Wolf from Oklahoma City University in Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. That's a lot of Oklahomas there. It's good to have you here this morning. And I know that others are going to be watching with us via our website and Facebook and YouTube, and we're happy to have you here this morning. As we begin our time together, I want to remind you of some things that are coming up. First of all, following this Faith for Living at 10:30, there will be a webinar led by Dr. Ben White of Clemson University, South Carolina, and he will be talking about the making of the Bible, how the books came to be, how they were selected, and how the Bible was put together. Very interesting and something you may not have thought about. That will be this morning, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And then tomorrow evening, Dr. Wolf will be with us here at the Steele Memorial for our Vesper service. And on Thursday evening, Reverend Karen Graham will be here to celebrate the sacrament of Holy Communion. And I also remind you that our picnic is Wednesday evening at Perry Park, and all are invited to attend. Not only is Dr. Wolf with us, but her sister, Katie, who is a talented musician. Those of you who heard her yesterday know that already, and I don't need to tell you that. But I want to share with you that Katie is also here and is going to lead some music, and that will be a special treat for us this morning. So without further ado, I would like to call on Katie to lead an opening song.
Good morning. This is an old revivalist song that Aaron Copeland set many years after the fact, called Zion's Walls. Come, fathers and mothers, come, sisters and brothers, come, join us in singing the praises of Zion, the praises of Zion. Oh, fathers, don't you feel determined to meet within the walls of Zion? We'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round, we'll shout and go round the walls of Zion. The walls of Zion. Come, fathers and mothers, come, sisters and brothers, come join us in singing the praises of Zion. Come, fathers and mothers, come, sisters and brothers, come, join us in singing the praises of Zion, the praises of Zion, the praises of Zion.
Aren't the people in Knoxville, Tennessee lucky that hear Katie every Sunday? Don't you wish you lived there? Thank you so much. Katie comes to us from the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. It is my distinct privilege to introduce to you Dr. Lisa Wolf, who was one of my kids in camp 100 years ago. And then she grew up and became famous as an Old Testament scholar. She has written this book, Ruth, Esther, Song of Solomon, and Judith, which is at the Fine Print Bookstore, and also her newest volume on Koheleth, which is Ecclesiastes, the book of Ecclesiastes, and that is, it just came out in March, and that's there too. She's a graduate of United Seminary and Northwestern and Garrett Theological Seminary, where she received her PhD, and she's been teaching for several years at Oklahoma City University. She's here this week with her husband, Fred Mishler, and their two children, Bram and Phoebe, who are taking classes at the Rhine Center this morning, and we're happy to have them here this week and enjoying Lakeside and have Lisa back home. Would you welcome Dr. Lisa Wolf?
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks everyone who is joining us either in person or online this morning. That's great. We are glad to have you with us. And, I have to call Katie back up because we're going to start with a song, actually. So this morning, if you have a handout, if you don't have a handout, raise your hand. And Charlie will get to you. And if you're online, I believe there's a link so you can download the handout. So
Lisa likes notes.
I like notes, yes. And so I'm going to be teaching this morning about some sisters. And these are 5 sisters. Their names are mentioned quite a few times in the Bible. And as my colleague Will Gaffney, who's on your bibliography, has mentioned, you know, there's so many unnamed women in the Bible. When their names are included, we should learn them and say them. And so as I was working on this material last summer, I thought, how is it that people learn the names of Bible characters? And it occurred to me that one of the most common ways we do that is through songs.
Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he, like that.
Or Father Abraham had 7 sons, which I think
sons.
was a song that was written by a United Methodist pastor.
That we learned at Institute.
Probably.
I
So
did.
anyway, Katie and I are old institutors, meaning
Previous, not
yeah, okay. Anyway, so we wrote a song about the sisters that I'm going to teach about today from
I'm
who
sure
are in
we stole it from somebody. Actually.
Numbers.
We just set the lyrics.
Numbers 27 and Numbers 36. The sisters are Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah. And so we wrote this song together. We're going to sing it to you, and it's a call and response. So we sing, you sing back. If you're at home, you should sing along too. So here's how it goes. Are we ready?
Uh-huh.
Oh,
There were 5 sisters who said it wasn't fair. There were 5 sisters who said it wasn't fair.
And they went to Moses saying, Dad's land should be theirs.
That's kind of a tongue twister. We're
Okay,
going to
we'll
do that
do that
one
again.
again for
Okay.
you.
And they went to Moses saying, Dad's land should be theirs.
This is just like being at camp, everybody. Okay, and they went to, I'll do it with you, ready? And they went to Moses saying, Dad's land should be theirs.
And they were named Mahlah,
Mahlah,
Noah,
Noah,
Hoglah,
Hoglah,
Milcah,
Milcah,
Tirzah.
Tirzah.
And we'll start at the beginning again. And
There were 5 sisters who said it wasn't fair. There were 5 sisters who said it wasn't fair.
And they went to Moses saying,
Dad's land should be theirs. And they went to Moses saying, Dad's land should be theirs.
It's Dad's
land. I know it's hard to get that extra S in there. Thanks. Do the name part.
They were named Mahlah,
Mahlah,
Noah,
Noah,
Hoglah,
Hoglah,
Milcah,
Milcah,
Tirzah,
Tirzah,
and Zelophehad was their dad.
and Zelophehad was their dad.
All right.
See, if
nice
we were
job.
at camp for a week, we would learn that. Yeah, that was the quick version.
You've all had a little mini Hebrew lesson now too. I always tell my Hebrew students that you'll get those guttural sounds like Mahlah, especially well if you have allergy issues, which I think most of us here at Lakeside do. Mahlah. And even if you can only pick up a couple of those names, that would be an improvement. Mahlah, Noah is an easy one to remember because everybody knows the Noah, the boat guy, right? But then this is a woman named Noah, and Zelophehad was their dad. Now, typically, the women in this story have been known by the name of their father, and I'm aiming to change that so that we can actually learn their names. So I'm going to start by reading the passages for you. So hang in there with me on it. And I will say, if you wanted to follow along, I'm reading from the New Revised Standard Version, and you can pull it up on your phone easily at a website called oremus.org, O-R-E-M-U-S. If you just pull that up on your browser, you can get oremus.org. You can also get the New Revised Standard Version on some apps, but I think usually you have to pay for it. But oremus.org is free. So I'm reading from Numbers 27, 1 through 11. Then the daughters of Zelophehad came forward. Zelophehad was son of Hepher, son of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, son of Joseph, a member of the Manassite clans. The names of his daughters were Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. They stood before Moses, Eleazar the priest, the leaders, and all the congregation at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And they said, "Our father died in the wilderness. He was not among the company of those who gathered themselves together against the Lord in the company of Korah, but he died for his own sin, and he had no sons. Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers." Moses brought their case before the Lord. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "The daughters of Zelophehad are right in what they are saying. You shall indeed let them possess an inheritance among their father's brothers, and pass the inheritance of their father to them. You shall also say to the Israelites, if a man dies and has no son, then you shall pass his inheritance on to his daughter. If he has no daughter, then you shall give his inheritance to his brothers. If he has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to his father's brothers. And if his father has no brothers, then you shall give his inheritance to the nearest kinsman of his clan, and he shall possess it. It shall be for the Israelites a statute and an ordinance, as the Lord commanded Moses." So this is where Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah appear first, in Numbers 27. They show up again at the very end of Numbers in chapter 36. So I'll read that next, and then I'll go on to kind of unpack all of this. In Numbers 36, we read, "The heads of the ancestral houses of the clans of the descendants of Gilead, son of Machir, son of Manasseh, of the Josephites' clan, came forward and spoke in the presence of Moses and the leaders, the heads of the ancestral houses of the Israelites. They said, 'The Lord commanded my Lord to give the land for inheritance by lot to the Israelites. And my Lord was commanded by the Lord to give the inheritance of our brother Zelophehad to his daughters. But if they are married into another Israelite tribe, then their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our ancestors and added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they marry. So it will be taken away from the allotted portion of our inheritance. And when the Jubilee of the Israelites comes, then their inheritance will be added to the inheritance of the tribe into which they have married, and their inheritance will be taken from the inheritance of our Lord, saying, the descendants of the tribe of Joseph are right in what they are saying. This is what the Lord commands concerning the daughters of Zelophehad. Let them marry whom they think best. Only it must be into a clan of their father's tribe that they are married, so that no inheritance of the Israelites shall be transferred from one tribe to another. For all Israelites shall retain the inheritance of their ancestral tribes. Every daughter who possesses an inheritance in any tribe of the Israelites shall marry one from the clan of her father's tribe, so that all Israelites may continue to possess their ancestral inheritance. So then it goes on to say, the daughters Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, Tirzah all did what had been said, and they married sons of their father's brothers into the clans of the descendants of the Manassites. And then we meet them one more time in Joshua, where after Moses has died, and Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah go to Joshua, to Eleazar and Joshua, and they're asking again for this inheritance. So let me give a little bit of background, kind of contextualization, because I find, in my teaching travels that not a lot of people have been reading Numbers recently. So just, kind of to give you some orientation. And when I teach intro Bible, the first and last thing I always do is make everybody to memorize the biblical timeline. And that's so that you can kind of get in your head, where these things are happening chronologically, since the Bible isn't necessarily arranged chronologically. So here's just the brief few select items on the timeline that precede where we are here in Numbers. So there was creation and the ancestors, slavery in Egypt, and then being led out of slavery by Moses, called the Exodus. And then now we're in the time of wandering and complaining in the desert, led by Moses. And so what's happening, Numbers is called Numbers because they count the people. And the reason that they're counting the people, they're taking census, right? The reason they're doing census is in order to know how to divvy up the so-called promised land once they get there. So they don't have that land yet, although when they were actually writing this material, it was long in the past anyway. So, but the way Numbers is presented, they're counting everybody, and so in order to know how many lots of land will need to be divvied up among the people. And one of the things that we run into in this text is a reference to the first generation and the second generation. So Zelophehad, the dad, rhymes, he was in that first generation. Now, a bunch of the people from that first generation had died because they rebelled against the Lord. And in a gripping story from Numbers 16, a bunch of those people got swallowed up by the earth. So in case you hadn't read Numbers 16 recently. And so this discussion is happening when they're counting the second generation, and we're getting ready to get to Deuteronomy, which I always think of. Deuteronomy is the people are standing there like looking over into the promised land, waiting to get in there, but they have to listen to a really long sermon from Moses first, where he goes back through everything, and then he dies, and then they can go. So that's where we are in Numbers. Now, a couple of other background things is that probably you picked up on this, but maybe didn't name it. So we're dealing with a patrilineal society. So land was passed from father to oldest son, and that becomes the problematic issue here. And we also hear talk of passing down one's name, and so the passing down of a name and the passing down of land kind of go together here. So it's about land and inheritance. I don't know if you noticed when I was reading that second passage from Numbers 36, the repetition of the term inheritance, inheritance, inheritance. It's really about that topic. Inheritance. What is the inheritance and who will get it? So as I look at Numbers 27, which is really my main focus, I see four parts of that text. These women, these sisters, approach, stand, state, and demand, which also is kind of rhymey, so that always helps. And the very opening word in verse 1 in Hebrew, my colleague Will Gaffney, again, she's on your bibliography, pointed out what I should have noticed as a Hebrew teacher, because this is usually how Hebrew goes, or very often anyway. Very often the sentence begins with the verb. And so I always tell my students it's like how Yoda speaks. Approach they did, right? So the whole thing starts out with approach. And approach had, it wasn't just about movement, but it had an aura of holy movement too, that's what you did when you were bringing a request to the Lord. Here they're bringing a request to Moses and the priest Eleazar and the elders. So they approach, and then they stand before the elders and they state their case. So they state their case of, here's the problem. Our father should have been getting land because he wasn't one of those people who got swallowed up by the earth. Presumably he died of natural causes. So he would have been getting land except that he had no son. So they then they state their case, and they use a wonderful question. They say, why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Why should the name of our father be taken away from his clan because he had no son? And then they move to the demand. They say, give us a possession. Give us a possession among our father's brothers. So there's no reason that their father's land should be lost to the rest of the tribe and his name be lost, as it were, just because we are daughters, say Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. Now, the interesting next part of it is that Moses does not take it upon himself to answer the question. He goes to the Lord for, and the way we would think of this in the context of the Pentateuch, or the first 5 books of the Bible, is that Moses goes for new Torah. Torah means teaching, but it also refers to those first 5 books. He goes back to the Lord to ask what he should do. And this is only one of 4 instances where Moses does that. So it makes it pretty significant in the context of those first 5 books of the Bible. And then the Lord affirms the daughters. The daughters were right, it said, and brings a new Torah to Moses. So in the larger context, again, it's almost a little, well, comical might not be quite the right word, but like, what happened, Moses? Did you miss something there? And the other part is that the daughters, because they get affirmed by what Moses said, it's like the daughters knew this teaching, but Moses didn't. So it's something that the rabbis, the medieval rabbis who were writing the Talmud, they puzzled over that. And in fact, in Midrash Rabbah Bamidbar, the rabbis wrote, the inheritance Torah was revealed to the women because of their merit or worth. And in Bava Batra, they wrote that these women were righteous exegetes and sages. So these women are really exalted in the history of understanding the book of Numbers. Now, the thing is, after the Lord affirms what Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah said about this land, the Lord does them one better, or all women, really, and says, well, this isn't just for these 5 women, this is for all the women of Israel. If a father dies and there are no sons, then the women can inherit. And then additional teaching on inheritance, which remains largely patrilineal, about inheritance of brothers and uncles and so forth. So when we move to Numbers 36, that second passage I wrote, it's almost like we get some backpedaling. And interestingly, in that passage, when the other members of the Manassite clan go to Moses, Moses doesn't go to the Lord to ask the Lord's opinion there. Moses just says, oh, right, I see the problem here. If the women really married whoever they wanted, then the land could be lost to another tribe, because it would still be patrilineal, right? The whole system didn't change. It's just that these daughters are more of placeholders. And so they give these caveats. Well, they can marry whomever they want as long as they're part of the same tribe. So especially for feminist interpreters, that first passage, like seems like a win, and then the next one you go, well, okay, patriarchy wins again. But this is what we have. So we get. Then there's this ongoing saga where their names are revisited again and again in Joshua and in Chronicles. And I think, for me, kind of the summary comment about Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah is that they stand guard against a view of women, biblical women, that would say, oh, biblical women couldn't inherit land. I've heard many people say that. Well, that's not the case. Actually, they could, and they did sometimes, and there are more cases than just this. So the situation of biblical women is maybe more complicated than what some people would want to give it credit for, and so I want to highlight this. Also to note that these women were there. They were interacting with Moses and Eleazar and the elders. They approach, stand, state, and demand. They are not voiceless. They are not nameless. And one other thing that I think is really interesting is that the narrator never says anything to try to put these women in their place. They use their assertive resistance to just do what they need to do. And so you never get a sense of, at least not from the narrator, oh, they were so out of place as women to be going and talking to Moses and the elders. That may be something that we place on the text, is a sense of a surprise that 5 women, biblical women, would be able to do this. But the narrator doesn't seem surprised about that at all. So let me shift a little bit because, as I mentioned in my sermon yesterday, whether you heard it or not, I'll say it again, that I felt called this spring as I was working on these teaching sessions to link each of these stories of biblical women to issues related to the Black Lives Matter movement. And what really struck me about Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah and this text about inheritance is the issue of inheritance and lack of inheritance, and leading to the topic of reparations. And so I'm going to talk about that a little bit now. I was thinking about the question that Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah ask: why should the name of our people be taken away from his clan because he had no son? Give to us a possession among our father's brothers. And I was thinking of the pleas of African Americans in this country for hundreds of years to say, why should we receive no inheritance? And numerous scholars agree that the root of racial inequalities and racial tensions in this country has to do with the fact that the 250 years of slavery in this country was never financially accounted for. So I'm going to go through a few historical details on this issue. Why should we receive no inheritance, says the Black population of America. And some of this you may know, some of it may be new to you. So for 250 years, Black enslaved persons were the foundation financially of this country. It is the only reason this country succeeded financially, as far as some scholars are concerned. But then, after the Emancipation Proclamation at the end of the Civil War, for another 100 years, white society systematically destroyed any Black efforts to gain land or wealth. And there's 2 prominent pogroms to mention here. One in Rosewood, Florida, where there was a fairly financially healthy and stable Black community that was completely wiped out, a massacre there. And then also the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was called the Black Wall Street, also wiped out in 1920, I believe. And then we had redlining that prevented Black families from accumulating the main means of accumulating wealth in this country, which has been home ownership. The Black tax related to that, which, depending on the time period and the scholar who you consult, can be as much as $20,000 additional per year. But let me go back again to the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. And many of us have probably heard about the 40 acres and a mule that was promised to the newly freed former slave families. And one thing that I discovered that was interesting about this is that there were a group of prominent black men at the time who were consulted by General Sherman and President Lincoln to come up with that plan. Among those men were Methodist clergy, interestingly enough. And so they came up with this 40 acres and a mule plan. And that was in 1865, or early in the year. And they had the land ready. They divvied it out. Families went and claimed their land. The mule thing was kind of an afterthought, and I'm not sure that everybody got a mule, but families settled, they built, they planted, but then 4 months later, after these communities had been established, and Lincoln was assassinated, then President Johnson rescinded the promise of 40 acres and a mule. It took it away, gave the land back. Henry Louis Gates Jr. wrote that that land was returned, here's his quote, to the very people who had declared war on the United States of America. So there was an attempt at reparations for formerly enslaved persons in America that lasted for 4 months, and then it was taken away. And so for many scholars of race issues, and I am not one of them, I'm dabbling here, right? But for many scholars have said, really, that is the root of the problem we have, and really what happened was you have so many people, human lives that had been enslaved for generations and generations, and then you're free. Well, free for what? You got no money, you got no land, you have communities of people who want to kill you. So this has been a huge problem, and it has resulted in a massive wealth gap. So there's some very good research on the wealth gap between blacks and whites in America, and the numbers vary a little bit, and that is that for $100 of white wealth, and this is not the same as income. Wealth is more of your total picture, not your monthly or annual income. For $100 of white wealth, a black family will have between 1 to 10% of wealth. So it's a very large gap, massive. And wealth is what gets passed on. Wealth is how many white people buy their houses, go to college, buy a car. For many of my students, when the pandemic hit and they were newly out in the job market, the wealth of their family is how they had a place to go and stay, because they lost that new job and they lost that new apartment. And so wealth is what gives you a safety net from your family. And this isn't a matter of savings. In fact, the research shows that black families save and pay more for education than white families. There was a great video that came out on YouTube during the time of the protests, and it's on your bibliography. It's a woman named Kimberly Jones, and she's actually a preacher, which you can tell if you watch the video. The video went viral, and in it, she talks about playing Monopoly. And she said, imagine we're playing a game, a 400-year-long game of Monopoly. And if you're black, you have to go for hundreds of years without ever getting any money when you pass go. You're not ever allowed to buy the properties. And yet all the white players are accumulating all this time for hundreds of years. And then suddenly, everybody says, oh, okay, well, now you can really start playing catch up. how on earth do you do that? And so one of the things that really struck me is a study out of some researchers at Duke University that concludes, here's the quote, "There are no actions that Black Americans can take unilaterally that will have much of an effect on reducing the wealth gap. For the gap to be closed, America must undergo a vast social transformation produced by the adoption of bold national policies." That's striking to me. There's just no way to even out, reduce that wealth gap without there being some policy changes made. Now, another thing that I discovered was that back in 1993, that's a long time ago now, as my kids say, in the 19-somethings. In 1993, there was a bill introduced in the House, H.R. 40. You can look it up on the internet. It's still there. H.R. 40 was introduced, and this is a bill about studying reparations. It's just to do a study on reparations. What would that look like? Now, if you're interested in reparations, if you're having a lot of questions, well, like, how much would that be, and where would the money come from, and who would be involved, and how would you take care of that, and all the problems. I mean, there are books and books written about this. And I draw your attention to my bibliography. Without reading books and books, you can read the Ta-Nehisi Coates piece in The Atlantic from, I think it was 2014. The Case for Reparations, interestingly prompted by police brutality cases at that time. And then again, the much more recent piece called What is Owed by Nicole Hannah-Jones from the New York Times Magazine. And those pieces contain a lot of the research that I'm giving you here. I have not read all the books. I've dabbled, so I've got some idea, but I think that one thing that we can do, those of us who care in the white community who say, well, we hear what's going on, we want things to change, we want there to be good race relations, but how can that happen? And I think that pushing for reparations is one way. Now, interestingly, since we're here at Lakeside, United Methodist Mecca of Ohio, and in 2016, the United Methodist General Conference did adopt a support for reparations for African Americans, and the adoption of that resolution goes all the way back to 1996. So that issue has been on the agenda of the General Conference for quite some time. It is not a foreign issue. It's something that many Christians, mainline Christians in particular, have adopted resolutions about. And when I went to read the, I didn't bring my 2016 Book of Resolutions with me. I'm sure Charlie has it in his apartment, but you can pull it up online. You've got a pocket edition handy, but if you can look it up online, and when you read it, it really goes back to that H.R. 40, that bill that's been introduced in the House for many, many years, which promotes, let's study reparations. What would that look like? How could this country make some policy changes that would help even things out? And this is another book that I would recommend. It's called Dear White Christians, for those still longing for racial reconciliation, by Jennifer Harvey. And in it, she makes this statement: a reparations paradigm requires us to ask the question that seems unthinkable to many white Christians, that without repentance and repair having come prior, why would we even assume interracial relations to be desirable or beneficial for Christians of color? And I think one thing that comes up in race relations conversations on the part of white people who care is a question, why are black people so angry? I don't understand. And I think that her comment really speaks to that. Is that just supposed to go away when there continue to be these huge gaps in wealth, when there continue to be really discriminatory policies, and when there continue to be situations like what we all saw on video with George Floyd being so brutally killed? And of course, we can look at the list of individuals who have suffered in that way. I want to go back now to the Bible and not to Numbers, though I'm happy to go back to Numbers when we get to the question and answer part, which is always my favorite part, so I'll leave some time for that for sure. Interestingly, when I was reading Ta-Nehisi Coates' piece from 2014 piece from The Atlantic on reparations, which was very influential, he opens with a quote from Deuteronomy 15. Now, you may have noticed in Numbers 36, that second passage, it referred to when the day of Jubilee comes. So there's this concept, it's in the Pentateuch and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and mentioned in Numbers, of Jubilee, that there were forms of slavery in ancient times. Certainly we know that from the book of Exodus. But the provision for Jubilee was a time when that would end. And so here's the passage that Coates quotes from Deuteronomy 15. Deuteronomy 15, 12 through 15. If a member of your community, whether a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you and works for you for 6 years, in the 7th year, you shall set that person free. And when you send a male slave out from you, a free person, you shall not send him out empty-handed. Provide liberally out of your flock, your threshing floor, and your winepress, thus giving to him some of the bounty with which the Lord your God has blessed you. Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. For this reason, I lay this command upon you today. So I think that reparations, like the ability of Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah to inherit, is well worth our consideration as a society. It may be the only way to repair the wealth gap, but also to address the pervasive issues of racism through a public admission of the sin of slavery, which additionally serves as amends on the part of white culture. So I wonder, would we stand with Mahlah, Noah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah to ask for a new teaching on inheritance? Will we stand for reparations, a new teaching in our time to undo racism? So I end with those questions to you, and I'd like to open it to questions for me. And I think we may have a microphone we can bring around if you have a question. And remember, I've been a professor for a long time. So if you don't have a question, I have ways of getting you to ask something. And if all else fails, I'll just keep talking anyway. But this is also your chance to ask anything you ever wanted to ask of a Bible scholar, and I'll do my best.
Thank you for coming to Lakeside. You spoke of reparations in the vague term. Do you have any concept of what it would look like? Because it strikes me that the devil is in the details.
Right, the devil is in the details for sure. And that's why the H.R. 40 is about studying it. There are, as I said, there are a number of books, and I have not read them, that give details. I have read about certain kinds of details, such as ability to trace one's family genealogy back to persons who were enslaved in America, kind of like, I would think, analogous to what happens for tribal membership in Native American tribes here. And that, again, that's a detail that varies. What the money looks like, what the numbers are, where it comes from, those things all vary. One thing that I found is that doing reparations, paying reparations, is not a novel concept. It happens in other situations, and it has happened. It's a legal term. It's the kind of thing that happens when someone has been wronged and a court determines this individual has been wronged, or even a community in some cases. So for instance, Florida did pay some reparations to descendants, direct descendants of individuals who had lived in Rosewood, that community that was massacred by a white pogrom in the 20s. It is to undo a wrong. And again, what the amount is, it depends on who you ask. There are different proposals about that. Where the money comes from, usually from federal government out of tax base, how it would be raised, of course. I mean, yes, the devil's in the details, but the fact that this bill has stalled for more than 25 years tells me that legislators do not feel much of a push from white Americans, which is where it's going to have to come from, I think, to really get going for that to happen. So I think that pushing legislators to say, we want to see this studied. We want to see, can somebody come up with a good deal? And I'm sure that whatever anybody did come up with would not get universal approval. Some people wouldn't like it, just like any big, important legislation. But I think it's still worth pursuing, absolutely. Your mic isn't on.
Yeah. Lisa, some of us looked at and studied the Color of Compromise a couple weeks ago here at Lakeside, and one of the suggestions that author made in terms of reparations, and I don't know if this relates, is scholarships for black students that would, as you mentioned, white people usually keep, well, a lot of people do if they can, but have money saved up for their kids to go to college, and oftentimes that's not possible for African Americans, and to establish scholarships. So that would help, I think, to move the gap close the gap. It wouldn't be quite the same thing, but there's another idea.
Thank you. That's helpful. I haven't read that book, but that sounds like a good recommendation too. The Color of Compromise.
Color of Compromise by Jamar Tisby. Mm-hmm. Marianne.
Just a thought, but we always wait for somebody else to do something, for the government to take over, and we'll wait and see. I found that if you really have something on your heart, you should do it yourself. If you know someone who's struggling with college tuition, help them find a scholarship or give them some money, because we have it. We're all here because we have money. So do it. Take it on your own heart and give it. That's just my thought.
I'm so glad you said that. I really think that a lot of people want to do something and we don't know what to do. And I think one thing we start with is do what you do. I preach and teach, so there you go. So do what you do and figure out how you contribute in that way. I think giving money is a great start. And I know at the university where I teach, we've had a scholarship fund that has specifically focused on students of color, but the money in that pot is never enough to create the kind of diversity and do the kind of outreach that we really want to do. So I think that's a great answer. There's a great video that I think I do not have on my resource list, but you could find it with the magic of search engines and so forth. The person in the video is Phil Vischer, Vischer. You may know his name because he created VeggieTales, which we could talk about from my Bible scholar point of view another time. But he apparently, I had not known this about him, has some expertise in history of race relations. And he does this great little video on the history of race relations in America. And he ends it with, I don't know what we do, but we can at least care. And that is a pretty good starting point. At least care enough to learn, care enough to see what we could do, and to be talking about it in our communities, whether having a book study or just making it a part of conversation or shutting down somebody's racist comments in a group you might be in.
Erwin Jennings. I share this not to call attention to ourselves, to my wife and I, but my wife and I are funding an interracial family to come to Lakeside for a week in August. So it's something we could at least do that.
I think that's great. I'm glad that you shared that, funding an interracial family to come to Lakeside. I think, how can Lakeside be thinking about diversity and making sure, like, the gates are a tricky thing. Gates, walls, stuff like that are problematic in certain parts of the Bible, right? But we all also kind of get why the gates are there and what's good about that. So how do we go beyond the gates? I'm going to talk about that a little bit more later this week, in fact. But that's a great idea. I think one important thing to be thinking about is also to remember, though, how can we always be asking Black communities what can be done? How can we hear what your experience is, and not try to solve the problem in our own way? So that the solution, we need to make sure that the solution is something that works for Blacks in this country. Anybody have a Bible question? Come on, some burning question you always wanted to ask a Bible scholar. Where did the Ark of the Covenant go? It's in a warehouse. You have to watch Raiders of the Lost Ark to find that out. Yeah, no, we don't know. Why haven't you heard a sermon on Numbers recently? It's hard to preach Numbers, but it can be done. So I'll close then, if there's no other questions, and remind you of my main point, one of my main points about the text, which is there are women there. There are these daughters. They have names: Mahlah, Hoglah, Milcah, and Tirzah. You could memorize them if you tried. Learn the song. You can go back to the video and replay the song that Katie and I taught you. The daughters are there. Their voices are there. Women in the Bible are not invisible or silent or landless. And similarly, in our own time, I would hope that our call would be to ensure that no one is silent or voiceless or landless. So I'll end with that.
Dr. Wolf, I want to thank you for your provocative presentation. It's caused us all to think what we can do and where we go from here. I can only reflect on how courageous those 5 women had to have been to go to Moses, this great leader, this great man, and here are these 5 women going to him and pleading their case and then for Moses to take them so seriously that he took their case to the Lord and made a policy change for Israel. I think it's such an inspiring story. I want to thank Dr. Ned and Shirley Dwyer for their sponsorship of this week. Indeed, Ned is our Director Emeritus of Religious Life here at Lakeside, and he and Shirley contributed so much for 7 years while they were here and continue to have such an influence. And they would be here, if it wasn't for the virus this summer, they would be here with us, but they decided to stay home this summer, and we wish them well. We look forward to seeing them again. Can we have a closing word of prayer together? Dear God, we give you thanks for this beautiful day. We give you thanks for the teachings that come from your word. We thank you for sending Dr. Wolf to us to share insights that she has gained and that we can all learn from. We give you thanks for those that have kept the light of faith burning brightly in this place through the years. And we pray that you would be with us as we hear new challenges and see new opportunities to serve you and the people that you love. Be with us as we move forward, knowing that in your sight, Black Lives Matter and all of our lives matter. We give you thanks for this time that we can spend together and for this time that we can spend in reflection upon the things of the Spirit. Bless us throughout the day, we pray, and keep us in your care. Amen.